Imagine standing on the rain-swept docks of London in the year 1340. Before you lie row upon row of bulging burlap sacks, packed tight with raw English wool. To the merchant elite of Florence, Ghent, and Bruges, this fiber is not mere fleece. It is raw, unadulterated economic gold. It is the single most valuable raw commodity in the Western world, fueling giant textile empires that clothe popes, emperors, and armies across the European continent. Every major bank in Europe wants to buy it, and you possess an absolute monopoly over its production. But as you prepare to sell your harvest to foreign buyers, you run straight into a wall of royal steel. King Edward III has issued a total embargo on the export of precious metals. Royal inspectors comb through every outgoing vessel. Carrying silver or gold coins out of the kingdom is treated as an act of high treason, punishable by hanging, drawing, and quartering. The monarch decrees that every piece of bullion minted in England must remain within the realm to fund royal crown debts and military campaigns. Now consider the impossible equation facing you. The wealthy cloth merchants of Flanders and Italy have chests overflowing with gold florins and silver groats sitting in continental vaults, but they cannot bring physical bullion into English ports without risking confiscation. Meanwhile, you cannot accept foreign coin inside England because royal regulators strictly mandate payment in crown currency, nor can foreign buyers ship physical money out once trades are finalized. If you attempt to carry cash across the English Channel to pay your suppliers or clear your accounts, royal guards will seize your cargo and hang you from the yardarm. The entire engine of international trade ought to grind to a total halt. The physical medium of exchange is effectively outlawed at the border. So how did a secretive ring of medieval wool merchants and Italian merchant bankers transform this legal trap into a multi-billion-dollar financial empire? How did they manage to ship millions of pounds of raw wool across combat zones and international borders every single year, generating fortunes that dwarfed royal treasuries without moving a single chest of gold coin across the sea? To understand how this shadow financial network operated, you first have to dismantle a pervasive historical myth. Most people imagine medieval commerce as a primitive barter system or a crude economy where merchants hauled heavy oak chests filled with silver coins along muddy roads, guarded by mercenary knights. They picture simple markets where cash changed hands directly over wooden tables. That picture is completely false when it comes to high-stakes international trade. By the mid-14th century, dragging physical money across Western Europe was not just absurdly dangerous, it was economically impossible. Highway robbery was an organized industry along European roads. Local lords levied extortionate transit tolls at every river crossing and bridge. Shipwrecks claimed dozens of merchant vessels every season. Furthermore, the sheer weight of physical currency presented a massive logistical nightmare. Millions of silver coins required teams of heavy wagons, armed escorts, and months of grueling transit time, all of which bled profit at every turn. Adding to this chaos was the nightmare of currency fragmentation. Medieval Europe did not possess a unified currency. Every duchy, bishopric, free city, and kingdom minted its own coins with varying weights, purity, and debasement levels. A merchant traveling from London to Florence would encounter dozens of different coins, each subject to arbitrary exchange rates and rampant counterfeiting. If you attempted to settle a massive commercial shipment using physical coins, you were guaranteed to lose a substantial portion of your capital to clipping, debasement, and currency exchange scams before you even reached your destination. Yet, raw English wool was an absolute necessity for the European economy. The damp, chilly climate and rolling hills of the English countryside produced the longest, softest, and most durable sheep fleece on earth. The massive textile centers of Flanders, cities like Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges, and the giant industrial guild of Florence, known as the Arte della Lana, possessed hundreds of thousands of skilled workers and advanced dye houses. But they had almost zero native wool production. They depended entirely on English imports to keep their looms running and their urban populations employed. If English wool stopped flowing, the industrial heart of Europe would starve, triggering urban riots and economic collapse across the continent. This created a massive paradox. The demand for wool was immense. The supply was concentrated in England, but the law strictly forbade the movement of hard currency across borders. The system appeared completely broken, but where ordinary traders saw an insurmountable wall, an elite cartel of English wool merchants and Florentine financiers saw the opportunity to construct the most sophisticated shadow banking system the world had ever seen. You might assume these merchants found a way to physically smuggle gold coins past royal inspectors, hiding bullion in false-bottomed wool barrels or bribing port officials. Cross that thought out immediately. While minor smugglers certainly operated along the coastline, high-volume international trade could never rely on cheap tricks or petty bribery. The volume of trade was far too massive, and the risk of execution was far too absolute. Instead, these financial masterminds did something far more profound. They completely detached money from physical matter. They realized that in order to build an international trade empire, they did not need to move gold. They only needed to move information. The first breakthrough came through the systematic exploitation of a legal instrument known as the lettera di cambio, or the bill of exchange. To understand how this mechanism allowed merchants to bypass gold export bans entirely, imagine you are an English wool merchant in London selling 50 wool sacks to a representative of a Florentine merchant bank. Under royal law, you cannot receive foreign gold florins, and the Florentine buyer cannot export English silver coins back to Italy. Instead of handing over coins, the Florentine agent writes a formal notarized paper document, a bill of exchange. This document states that the buyer has received wool in London valued at 500 English pounds sterling. However, instead of paying you in London, the document commands the Florentine buyer's parent bank in Florence to pay your representative or business partner 500 pounds worth of gold florins in Florence, 60 days from the date of issue. Notice what just happened. No physical gold or silver ever crossed the English Channel. The English merchant sold his wool in London without receiving outlawed foreign coin, and the Florentine buyer acquired his raw materials without exporting English bullion. The physical wool moved south from England to Italy, while the paper obligation moved through private courier networks. Money moved across international borders purely as an entry in two ledger books located thousands of miles apart. You might wonder how the English merchant actually gets his hands on usable funds in London if his payment is sitting in Florence. This is where the true brilliance of the network reveals itself. The English merchant does not need to bring the Italian money back home. Instead, he uses his credit balance in Florence to purchase high-value continental luxury goods, such as fine Italian silks, Flemish tapestries, or French wines, which are legally cleared for import into England. Alternatively, he sells his Florentine paper debt to another English merchant who needs to buy goods in Italy. The Bill of Exchange effectively created a self-balancing, multilateral clearinghouse that spanned from London to Florence, Bruges, Venice, and Genoa. Millions of pounds sterling in trade were settled every single year without a single chest of gold coin leaving a vault. The merchant bankers had rendered physical currency obsolete for long-distance commerce. However, operating a paper credit system across thousands of miles introduced a brand new threat: trust. How could a merchant in London be sure that a piece of paper signed by an Italian agent would actually be honored in Florence 2 months later? How did these networks prevent rampant fraud, forgery, and default in an age before telegraphs, telephones, or centralized credit bureaus? The solution lay in the creation of tight-knit, closed-loop merchant cartels bound by family ties, religious oaths, and strict commercial discipline. The premier banking cartels of the era, most notably the Bardi, Peruzzi, and later the Medici families, operated sophisticated corporate structures with permanent branch offices stationed in every major commercial hub across Europe. These merchant houses developed private, high-speed courier networks that moved messages across Europe faster than royal diplomatic channels. Their couriers rode day and night, changing horses at dedicated stations, delivering merchant packets containing commercial intelligence, price lists, exchange rates, and ledger updates. If a merchant forged a bill of exchange or failed to honor a debt in Bruges, word reached London, Florence, and Venice within days. The offender was instantly blacklisted from the global network, destroying their ability to conduct business anywhere in the civilized world. In the medieval economy, reputation was far more valuable than physical gold. As the wool trade grew into a multi-billion-dollar engine, the English crown realized it was losing control over the country's greatest natural asset. King Edward III was locked in an agonizing, endlessly expensive war with France, the early stages of the 100 Years' War. The crown desperately needed immediate, hard cash to hire mercenaries, build warships, and supply armies operating in Normandy and Aquitaine. Seeing the immense wealth flowing through the wool trade, the king decided to weaponize the market. In 1363, the English crown established the Ordinance of the Staple, creating an absolute royal monopoly over wool exports. Under this draconian decree, all English wool intended for foreign buyers was legally required to pass through a single, heavily fortified port city, Calais, located right across the English Channel on the French mainland. If you were an independent wool grower or small trader, you were strictly forbidden from selling directly to foreign merchants at local ports. You were forced to sell your fleece exclusively to an elite, king-approved guild known as the Company of the Merchants of the Staple at Calais. The Calais staple operated as a fortress of economic control. By bottlenecking the entire wool supply of Western Europe through a single physical port under English military control, the crown accomplished two major goals. First, it made tax collection effortlessly efficient. Royal customs officials sat at the gates of Calais, levying heavy export duties on every single sack of wool that passed through the harbor before foreign buyers could touch it. Second, it turned the wool trade into a formidable diplomatic weapon. If a continental city-state or duke angered the English king, Edward III simply shut the gates of the Calais staple, cutting off that region's raw wool supply and plunging its textile industry into instant bankruptcy. For the elite members of the Company of the Merchants of the Staple, this compulsory monopoly was an absolute goldmine. They fixed purchase prices in England, keeping farm gate prices low for English sheep farmers, while artificially inflating sale prices for foreign buyers in Calais. They grew so unimaginably wealthy that their corporate headquarters in Calais operated like a sovereign city-state, complete with its own private army, courts, and internal treasury. Yet, despite this massive royal machinery, the system contained a fatal structural flaw. The core vulnerability was not the wool trade itself, but the insatiable financial appetite of the monarchs who attempted to exploit it. King Edward III realized that waiting for wool tariffs to trickle into royal vaults month by month was far too slow to fund his aggressive military operations. He needed massive amounts of cash up front to pay his mercenary armies. To secure immediate funding, the king turned to the giant Florentine banking houses, specifically the Bardi and Peruzzi cartels. The deal struck between the English crown and the Italian bankers was breathtaking in its scale and complexity. The Florentine banks agreed to advance hundreds of thousands of gold florins directly into the king's war chest. In exchange, Edward III granted the bankers exclusive royal licenses to export English wool tax-free, bypassing the standard tariffs paid by ordinary merchants. Furthermore, the king pledged the future tax revenues of the entire Kingdom of England directly to the Florentine banks as collateral. For a decade, this alliance between royal power and high finance seemed unstoppable. The Florentine bankers effectively bought control over the primary revenue stream of an entire nation. They collected taxes, managed the royal mints, and dominated the export market for English wool. Their profits soared to astronomical heights, making them the undisputed masters of European finance. You think they made money doing simple banking? Wrong. Cross that out completely. They were not merely bankers. They were integrated commercial oligarchs who controlled the entire supply chain, from the back of an English sheep to the finished luxury garments worn by kings in Paris and popes in Avignon. Then came the year 1345, and the entire house of cards collapsed into spectacular ruin. The catalyst for the catastrophe was a sudden, violent combination of military failure, royal overextension, and bad debt. The 100 Years' War dragged on far longer and cost vastly more money than King Edward III had ever anticipated. English military campaigns in France stalled, naval expenses mounted, and royal revenues were completely consumed by the interest on existing loans. To make matters infinitely worse, political instability erupted across Western Europe. A revolution broke out in the textile hubs of Flanders, shutting down looms and disrupting wool sales. In Italy, local wars drained the liquid reserves of the Florentine city-state, trapped under a mountain of debt he could never hope to pay. Edward III did what powerful monarchs throughout history have always done when faced with financial ruin. He simply defaulted. In a single royal declaration, the King of England unilaterally cancelled all his outstanding debts to the Florentine banking houses. He revoked their tax exemptions, seized their property within England, and refused to pay back a single gold florin. The total value of the defaulted loans was staggering, over 1.5 million gold florins, an amount that exceeded the total annual economic output of many Western nations at the time. The news hit Florence like a megaton bomb. The two largest financial institutions in the medieval world, the Bardi and Peruzzi banks, were wiped out overnight. They could not satisfy their obligations to their depositors, who rushed to withdraw their funds in a classic bank run. Within months, both banking giants declared total bankruptcy, dragging dozens of smaller merchant firms, suppliers, and artisanal workshops down with them into complete financial devastation. The collapse of the Florentine banks triggered the first systemic global financial crisis in recorded history. Liquidity dried up completely across Western Europe. Credit markets froze solid from London to Venice. Merchants could no longer secure bills of exchange to fund shipments. Trade routes fell silent, and urban unemployment soared in textile cities across Flanders and Italy. To compound the nightmare, just as the financial ruin reached its absolute peak, a far terrifying monster arrived on the merchant ships trading along the Mediterranean trade lanes, the Black Death. The plague swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, wiping out between 30 to 60% of the entire population. The carefully constructed commercial networks, courier routes, and banking houses built over centuries were smashed to pieces by a deadly combination of royal default and biological catastrophe. Looking back at this historic devastation, you might assume that the medieval wool empire and its shadow banking system vanished forever into the dustbin of history. But if you look closer at the world around you today, you will realize that the legacy of those medieval wool merchants never actually died. The system they built under the extreme pressure of royal bans, border restrictions, and economic embargoes laid the permanent blueprints for modern global capitalism. When medieval wool merchants invented the bill of exchange to move wealth without moving physical gold, they created the foundational mechanics of modern international banking, paper fiat currency, and electronic funds transfers. When they traded future wool harvests to secure upfront capital, they created the world's very first commodities futures market. The double-entry bookkeeping methods developed by Italian accountants to track wool shipments and credit balances became the universal financial language used by every corporation on Earth today. Even the political and institutional structures born during the medieval wool boom endure to this day. In the British Parliament, the official seat of the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords is not a throne of gold or carved oak. It is a large, square, red fabric sack stuffed tight with raw wool, known officially as the wool sack. Created in the 14th century by King Edward III, it was placed in Parliament to serve as a constant physical reminder to lawmakers that the true power, wealth, and defense of the realm rested not on crown jewels or royal bloodlines, but on the economic strength of the country's wool trade. The medieval wool barons and their merchant banker allies did not merely survive in an era when carrying cash across borders was forbidden under pain of death. They built an invisible, paper-based financial superhighway that completely bypassed the power of kings and feudal lords. They demonstrated for the first time in human history that true economic power does not lie in heavy chests of gold coin sitting inside a vault. True power lies in the flow of information, the strength of ledger books, and the ability to move credit across the globe at the speed of human trust.